Hi, this is Kara from the Special Needs Mom podcast.
And this is Angela from Especially Organized, Sensible Solutions for Special Needs Moms.
We have this heart for special needs moms. And so we thought, you know what, let's combine forces. And we have come up with what we're calling the Purge Party. And you can pretty much guess what it is. It's a party where we're going to come together and we're going to purge, or in general, accomplish a goal, a small goal together. So we have set this for January 27th, starting at 8 o'clock for my Pacific Coast people.
Which means 11 o'clock for all of you on the East Coast. So this is an opportunity. If you have something on your to-do list that has just been stuck there and you are wanting to move it up on the list, you're wanting to tackle, maybe it's a space or an area of your home or a category in your home that has just needed a little time and attention. This is your opportunity for you to be online with us while you work and have access for us to help you answer your questions, help guide you, and just serve you for those 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can tell like what we've designed is just this very high level of support for that project that you just haven't been able to tackle on your own. The thing that we are envisioning is that you get to leave this purge party feeling so accomplished because you did the thing. You started the year off getting that thing done that you were stuck on last year. And so it's a momentum builder, if you will. You can go ahead and sign up. We have a link ready for you. And we are offering this for $40 for the whole experience.
Absolutely. And we hope you'll join us. I think it's going to be really fun. It's going to be a great group of moms of special needs kids. So we all get each other. We all have an understanding of what it's like to have something on our to-do list, but just we haven't been able to tackle it yet. So I hope that you will join us. We're super excited to bring this to you, and we are thrilled to work with you.
All right. We'll see you all there. Hi, I'm Kara, life coach, wife, and mom to 4 incredible and unique children. It wasn't all that long ago that my son received a diagnosis that had my world come crashing down. I lacked the ability to see past the circumstances, which felt impossible, and the dreams I once had for my life and family felt destroyed. Fast forward past many years of surviving and not at all thriving, and you'll see a mom who trusts that she can handle anything that comes her way and has access to the power and confidence that once felt so lacking. I created the Special Needs Mom podcast to create connection and community with moms who find themselves feeling trapped and with no one who really understands. My intention is to spark the flare of possibility in your own life and rekindle your ability to dream. This isn't a podcast about your special needs child. This is a podcast about you. If you are a mom who feels anxious, alone, or stuck, then you are in the right place. Welcome. Hello and welcome back to the Special Needs Mom podcast. Today's episode is really more of a conversation between 2 moms who have years of experience with various types of hospitalizations. And this episode came about because Erica's a fellow podcaster and we have a podcasting community that we meet in. And we're kind of just talking about how we're both in various stages of recovery from the impacts of our children's health from the past year. And I think for both of us, it was helpful to hear another mom say and share that like it's been months, but I'm actually still recovering. And I think as many of you know now that I think it's really important to talk about the stuff that nobody talks about. And the rebel in me kind of likes to talk about things that you just don't hear out there in the wild very often. But then in this community of kindred spirits of moms who have traveled paths alongside us, that we can have these deep and intimate conversations, even with somebody that we don't know very well. It's interesting because the experience I have of Erica is that of a close friend, somebody who totally gets me, who I feel safe with, who I feel seen by. Yet I have no idea what her husband's name is. I just think that there's something really special that we as a community can bond together and have solidarity in these extreme circumstances. And so as you listen to this conversation, I want you to interject yourself as the third member of this trio. And if you're what some of us say, a medical mom, I have a feeling that you'll relate in very similar and in the kind of ways that your head's nodding in agreement. And if you're not a medical mom, perhaps your experience is that you're more connected to perhaps challenges with inclusion and challenges navigating the school system and challenges navigating social systems with your child that does not conform to what's out there right now. I want you to find your story in our story. So what are the parts that, even though we're talking about the hospitalization, what are the experiences that you have as a mother feel the same? My guess is when you're recovering from perhaps an event that is really hard, or perhaps it's a season where you're having meltdown after meltdown, and you just don't know when you're going to find up and right yourself. My guess is that you're going to relate to the experience that we have, even though you may not experience the hospitalizations. So again, I invite you to find your story inside of our story. Let me tell you a little bit about Erica. Erica is a researcher and disability activist. She has this unique perspective of both a disabled adult and previously a disabled child, and also the mother of 2 disabled children. So she's taken her story and she's obviously gone into activism. She's created a podcast called Atypical Truth, and I'll have all the information in the show notes so you can check it out. And she's applied her unique brilliance to being a statewide disability advocate. Happens to be in the state of Illinois where she lives. And she works with various organizations to move forward and even maintain support systems for not just our kids, but I'm going to go ahead and say all of society. Because what our kids need, everybody needs. And I'll have Erica's full story, full background, more information on her kids if you're interested in the show notes. But for now, I want you just to consider her a friend that you're sitting down with, kind of debriefing. Welcome, Erica. Welcome to the Special Needs Mom podcast.
Hi, Kara. Thank you for having me here. I'm grateful for the invitation that you sent to me.
It's almost like, when you get the mail and, you go through it and then there's like the junk mail, but then there's like the handwritten letter that you kind of save for the end. I feel like you're the handwritten letter. I was like, I wanted you on for a long time, but I was like, oh, it's going to be so special and wonderful. And I know that we could talk forever and actually hours and hours. But I want to get into the topic today. And to start, I want to give some context and perhaps some history to kind of our individual experiences as mothers who have had children hospitalized. And so why don't we share with giving a context of what your hospitalizations typically look like, how frequently, when did they start, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So my introduction to hospital life started immediately following my daughter's birth. And in my experience with this, it's never really been planned. And the frequency is something that is really out of our control. So we often find ourselves needing hospitalized for things like an illness that we couldn't really support, or something that wasn't resolving with all the equipment that we have in our, what I like to call our little field hospital at home.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
We do have a makeshift hospital in our home. So in all reality, I don't ever really leave hospital life. We just go to the hospital when we need the higher level, more critical level of care. And that can range in a week time frame to months. As they've gotten older, we have managed to shorten the stay by really managing as much as we can at home and really just taking them to the hospital at the last minute to get them hopefully over the critical acute phase of the illness. And then we get home as quickly as possible to resume the more intermediate level of care that is required post a hospitalization or following a hospitalization. Fortunately, with having two medically complex kids, there have been times where they're both sick, but only one is needing hospitalized. There's so far not been an incident where they are both hospitalized at once. However, we have experienced it where I literally came home one day with
oh my goodness,
our son, and then I was in the hospital the next day with our daughter.
Wow.
And that can be grueling.
Yeah.
It can wear on you.
That's not even
How
funny.
about you, Kara? What is it like with Levi? And did it start from birth, or was it something that you were slowly introduced to?
Definitely a sudden introduction. And for him, it was when he was 2 and 4 months. And I know this because that's what they put on his little bracelet. And it was, one day we were, I want to say normal family for lack of better words. And he was unwell and admitted to the hospital. We got the news that he had a major brain tumor and we were going to need surgery. Well, ultimately it ended in a 2-month hospitalization for that first stay. That was truly extraordinary. I think for his type of surgery, maybe a couple weeks would have been standard because he did have so much residual damage from the resection. He needed extra time. When you're in months, even past, I feel like a week, I feel like that's when you're actually living in the hospital versus just staying at the hospital. And so we very much made that transition. And I think we can talk about that in a bit and like what it makes it like leaving when you've started living somewhere new. We'll wait for later for that. And then since then, we have both planned and unplanned stays, where this last year actually were our only 2 planned stays, and every other hospitalization has been unplanned. So for Levi, he sometimes needs help when he has illness because of his conditions. His body just gets a little unregulated. And we've had the type of hospitalizations that start with an ambulance ride and really, those conversations with the doctors that you really never let go of. It's another episode. But so I think we have the experience in both, but I feel like what's most fresh in my mind at this time is those planned hospitalizations. So what I want to hear from you, if you're willing to share, is how do you gear up for the hospital? So like for me, my experience is mostly I want to share a little bit from what I can observe of myself, looking at myself like basically a year ago. This would have been the time I was doing that. I want to know for you though, because it sounds like it doesn't just happen in a second. It happens like, okay, it kind of builds to be like, we're getting to that point where we need more help. How do you prepare for that, both mentally, physically, and of course, emotionally?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I'm going to be honest. It's hard to separate the 3, mentally, physically, and emotionally.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm so glad you said that.
So, it's so automatic and yet not. It should never be automatic for someone, right? So typically when we are gearing up for a hospitalization, there's a lot of red flags. There's a lot of work that's already gone into the care of whatever is occurring. So I'm actually going to speak to our current situation because ironically, and maybe unsurprisingly, this topic is extremely relevant considering we are supporting our kids right now through an illness and doing what we can to keep them out of the hospital. So really gearing up for a hospitalization is more of us trying to avoid the hospitalization rather than preparing for one. It's always on the back burner, but it may look like, first of all, and I feel like I should have maybe noted this from the top, all of our hospitalizations have, it's not a great experience to see your kid hospitalized, but it has given me so many tools and skills that I didn't have before. So preparing to go to a hospital, or in our situation, avoiding the hospital, includes actions like deducing what is wrong. Is it a respiratory illness? Is it a urinary tract infection? Is it something with their ears? So we have an otoscope. I've learned to look in ears and know how to recognize different types of ear infections. Lung sounds. I can tell you all about the lung sounds of my children. And I'm not an expert of lung sounds or pulmonology, but I'm an expert on my kids' lung sounds and their pulmonological status. So it's kind of doing all these things to deduce what is going on and then communicating that with our home health team. So we have a nurse that helps us care for our children about 4 days of the week, getting their support and their medical opinions, and then communicating that to our teams, our local pediatrician, our team up in St. Louis, or our children's hospital. And then really working as a team to give them the best support we can in the home until we reach that threshold of where the support and the equipment we have will no longer be sufficient to their needs. And that typically looks like them needing something like intubation or BiPAP or an IV antibiotic that we just can't obtain from home easily. So when we do go to the hospital, I think as I'm like preparing for that, the hard part for me is that we never know, one, how long we'll be there, and two, if we'll be going home with them, because we are typically already at that critical stage when we're going that direction.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because we have a community, we have an extended family up there. We have our nurses that we love, our doctors that know us very well, people that we're happy to see if it were under different circumstances, let's say.
Yeah.
So there's a part of me that's going, okay, I'm relieved to know that where we're going knows our children. They have all these things to support them. I know that when we've gotten to this point, they will be in good hands, and we've done everything we can at home. We've exhausted all of our efforts, and that we'll be in company with people who know our children and love them and will take good care of not only them, but also us.
Yeah.
So in that, somewhere in that, I'm packing bags, I'm making phone calls, I'm getting our other child situated so that my husband can stay home, and he's the one who usually stays home with the other kid
Mm-hmm.
and make sure that their needs are still being met, because in our life, with them being immune compromised, 99.9% of the time, if one kid is sick, the other one will get it. Hopefully the other one will get it and it won't be as bad or critical because we are catching it so much sooner. We're already on high alert for it. So we are doing interventions much sooner without any doubts or without really having to take time, waste time to deduce what's happening. We know. So
it's so interesting as I'm hearing your experience. It's both going to the hospital, both of our experience, but mine is so different. And I think for a couple of reasons.
mm-hmm.
So like I said, we have the planned hospitalizations and then we have the sudden. And our sudden are sudden, right? So my son has adrenal insufficiency, which means that under certain situations, he needs help and he needs help now, which,
mm-hmm.
you know, so it's interesting. You live with the constant baseline medical needs of your children, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you're always managing. And we have this thing, but it's interesting how different they are in their own distinct ways. So
I fear and
yes, that's what
adrenaline, that's the same, right?
Yes.
Like you still don't know. I'm sure when Levi is at that point, when he's needing that kind of critical intervention, there's always that fear of how will he respond? Is it going to work?
Or where will he be when he needs the help?
Oh,
and
see,
so
we're only ever at home. I haven't even thought of that before.
Yeah, so
thank you for that perspective.
Yes, and at this time, California's EMTs don't carry the medication that he needs, and it's a thing over the whole national conversation. So he literally has to be under our care or at the hospital. Some people go as far as carrying it everywhere. We don't. And I think it's one of those things where we're always mitigating risks in our life. And this is just one. We've chosen to do it this way. But anyhow, I think the baseline of the picture that I have, and I think I just keep going back to it because I think it helps validate my experience, and I think it might yours as well, is as mothers, it's like we're living on a bed of ice, a lake of ice that's thawing. We know the ice will crack. We just don't know when, and we don't know how far we'll be from land. And we don't know if we're going to get the help we need, right? So if we're going to get what we need, and ultimately our children are going to be okay. So I think just acknowledging that our nervous systems are being asked to do something so intense, such a high level. And this is why I'm such an advocate for all the things I do in supporting my clients and nervous system and really, really, really taking care of ourselves, because it's like we're being asked so much more, I think, to live in this way. But I want to speak to just the difference about what my brain and nervous system does when we are looking at a quick hospitalization. So there's certain indicators, I'll leave them out as far as when Levi has certain things going on, it could lead to a hospitalization. And what I notice is my brain is just jumpy. It's like, we're going to the hospital. And I think as I reflect on this, I think it's more like, I really don't like being caught off guard. And so when something does happen, it's almost easier for me to accept and plan to go versus kind of being behind and not ready. Because I'm a planner. I mean, this is just how I like to be prepared. This is just the way I feel best in my body, to have a high level of, I'm very needy, but I don't say that in a way of self-criticism. I just have high sensitivities. And so I need to care for myself to honor those, which means I also don't like to be left without the ability to plan and predict and give myself what I need. So I think it's just so interesting how yours is like the focus and the energy is purely towards avoidance. And it's almost like because you essentially are home hospital, you don't jump, it sounds like I do. Whereas I'm like in my mind jumpy, right? Whereas I think the funny story that's not funny is recognizing last year at one point, I don't remember exactly the point, but I think it was when I was processing his new diagnosis and I was really scared. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to change my whole business and the name of my podcast because I'm no longer going to be a special needs mom. I'm going to be a bereaved mom. And me literally planning out a new business, this all happened in 30 minutes. Like in a span of 30 minutes, I went from kind of okay to giving up everything I loved, including my son, to start something new, which I think it's funny that I was thinking about my podcast and business at this point, but whatever. Our brains do funny things. But I think like for me, I guess what I'm highlighting is like my quick reaction to kind of trying to get ahead of it. So I'm not taken out or surprised. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, it's interesting too, because if or when for some people that day comes, it does move you into a different form of identity. And I don't know about you, but I'm not ready for that. I've seen a lot of that in my community of children with similar disabilities and medical complexities as our own. No one's ever ready, even though we try to plan for it, like you say. And but we also acknowledge that it is a different experience entirely. And there is a part of you that wants to prepare for that whenever you're faced with these sudden surprise hospitalizations, critical moments in our children's lives,
Yeah.
I also want to say, I think it's important to note that I wasn't always avoidant. So this is, my daughter's 6 years old. This is 6 years of learning and unlearning how to manage this. At first, jumping up and running to the hospital was our automatic response because, again, we didn't have the skills yet to support our children the way the hospital could. We had a lot to learn. Over the years, we have developed those skills, really honed in on how not just our children's needs, but our own too, as a family, weighing quality of life, because when we take them away from each other, when we take either of them into a new environment, that impacts their quality of life. They're scared. They're not going to recover as quickly. And it's unfortunately not exactly great for our quality of life as their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, that kind of learning, I wouldn't say necessarily to avoid, but learning to support them the way the hospital could up to that transitional care unit level. You know, the step down from the ICU is about where we know our threshold exists. And just being aware of that and knowing our own limitations in addition to the hospital's limitations. So in a way, the hospital below a transitional care unit level, they're limited in what they can do for our family. As far as, again, quality of life is one of the biggest factors for us. So if we're just staying in the hospital for them to observe them, that's not going to fly, because that is more problematic. It's more of a risk, and it's really not great for anyone's quality of life in our family. So that's something that we've just really had to learn. And I wanted to share that, because there might be people listening who are at the beginning of this journey when they are jumping to the hospital, because every illness is scary at the beginning, and every illness can be scary again at 12 years old, at 30 years old, because our needs change as we age. And again, we'll go to the hospital and we'll learn how to adapt to those needs. But I guess I want people to know that hopefully you get to a point where you do, as a caregiver, feel competent and empowered to provide the level of care and to be able to make that call and know in your heart without a shred of doubt that you're making the right decision for your child and your family, you know?
I'm so glad you pointed that out, because I think it just speaks to, one, it speaks to experience, right? It's like you have become, over the last 6 years, practicing literally every day, an expert in your children's care. And it didn't happen overnight. You didn't have it at first, and you had to develop it both in terms of the skills and observations and the learnings, but I also see a development of self-trust. Right? You had to learn how to trust your instincts, trust yourself, and ultimately trust that what you chose to do was going to be essentially enough, right? And knowing that we can't control what may happen, but allowing yourself to rest in the peace of, I've taken all the information in, I'm doing everything I know how to do, I'm consulting all the experts, and that's enough, you know? So I think it's really, it's a beautiful, actually, evolution and picture of your personal development in terms of just, I'm sure you can look back at the last 6-year journey and really kind of see this emergence of a different person because of your level of trusting yourself.
That's a very nice way of putting it. And I feel so glam when you put it that way. So thank you.
I want to touch on, that's so funny.
I have emerged.
I have emerged. You have. I want to touch on just the planned hospitalizations and then move on to kind of looking at actually the inpatient experience and both of our perspectives. Something I want to highlight as a difference of the planned hospitalizations is the intensity. And this, I'm speaking from my experience, right? I haven't interviewed 100 people on this. This is just really my story. But I have a feeling it's going to be relatable to many of you. So this is where I picture, again, I am a planner. I'm somebody that goes into high activation in stress. And so I can look at myself this time last year, and I just love her. I just think she's doing such a great job. I'm so proud of her. She kicked ass, by the way. And one of the things I particularly enjoy looking at is my obsession at that time about my front porch. You know, I don't have like I'm not like a home decorator person. I don't have a pretty kitchen, you know, but my front porch, I'll have you know, was going to look fantastic. So I love plants and flowers. And so I really put a lot of effort into getting my plants all put together. I got a sign. I got a new doormat. Like I was really very, very focused on this, which I think is just so funny because in a time when, maybe there was other things that time and energy could have gone towards, it was just this fixation that for me brought joy. Like I just enjoyed doing that. It was a controllable thing that I could look at and like to look at. It made me happy. And I was very aware at the time that it was very funny that I was really obsessing over this, but I just allowed it to be there. So that's just kind of a funny story. But then also I look at myself and just be like, and there was just the anticipation of what's coming, which is just awful. I'll say that. But then there's also the logistical parts of, for me, getting my life in order enough so that I could basically step away for an unforeseen amount of time. Right. So this is like the impact of career, family, and mobilizing, if you will, my people, my community. And thank God, I feel like I had so many resources. I know not everybody has that. And so I'm also big on supporting my people to develop the level of community and resources to have what they need when they need it. And, this again does not come overnight. And anyhow, I could go on a whole tangent on that too, about learning how to ask for help. But anyhow, I just wanted to highlight those differences because I see my responses as so distinctly different. And I'm sure, to the listeners out there, I'm sure you have your own experience. And I just think it's good to reflect and observe, and like I am to myself this time last year, and actually just going back and acknowledging myself for doing such an incredible job for what I did. But now I'm at the point where I'm actually unpacking the emotional impact of all that, right? So it was not the time a year ago. It was the time of activation and kind of like survival. And now is the time to mobilize the healing and recovery. Before we get to the after part, in terms of kind of getting through these things, I want to look at the hospitalization, right? So for you have many experiences. Actually, I think at this time last year, I think you and I were chatting. I think Carrie was hospitalized and we were chatting because I think, we were in at the same time. Well, I think there is distinct experience of like being in, like I think moms that are in, like we know what it's like to be in. I think there's this camaraderie of having somebody that also know what it's like to live at the hospital. I would love to hear from you what you notice about yourself when you go inpatient. Mm-hmm. What are your survival techniques? What do you just observe of yourself?
Well, I love that you praised yourself a year ago, and I think it is deserved. And I probably don't do it enough for myself, but when you ask me this question, I am just like thinking about myself and I'm like, dang, girl, you are on fire. Like I am so sharp. I am so attuned to everything that is going on. I am responsible. Maybe I'm not responsible, but it's automatic for me to kind of be the crisis manager. Mm-hmm. I'm the one that's ensuring that the communication is consistent. There's continuity between what is being communicated between the nurses, the physicians, the lab techs, the respiratory therapists. And just always, I kind of serve as the oversight for what's happening. But at the same time, I recognize that as being an autonomic response. I am fueled by adrenaline, and probably an unhealthy version, an unhealthy type of adrenaline, because I'm not really taking care of myself in those moments. I'm hyper vigilant and hyper focused on making sure that nothing is missed with my kid, and that everything that is being said to me or to our nurses or to the next person who's going to be handed the case, that it's clear. So I'm proud of myself because I think that is a lot of physical, emotional, and mental labor that we don't talk about a lot. It's really exhausting. On top of that, you have alarms going off that I think what I hate most about the hospital life is that I can't control those alarms.
Mm.
If I'm at home, I'm in control of silencing the monitors and taking over. But in the hospital, those monitors are not to be touched by us parents, even if we know
I'm
what
sure
we're
you've
doing.
cheated like we all have.
I'm not going to go on the record and admit that, but I'm giving you a look. And then there's also the part that I kind of mentioned earlier where we have a community there. So there's also a comfort, and there's emotional labor that goes into that, right? I'm seeing some familiar faces that I haven't seen in a long time. People who are excited to see us, just not about the circumstances, right?
Totally.
And we get to catch up. I get to have conversations with them that, I've missed out on for a couple of months. Someone who was once pregnant has now become a mother. Someone who was dating is now engaged. Someone who was once an environmental service worker now graduated as an RN and is our nurse. And just to see their evolution and to be close to them and have them close to us, there's a comfort amongst the adrenaline and the trauma and the fear. And it's unique. And it's also, those relationships are ones that we don't talk about a lot because they're hard to define. These are not people that I text with or that I send cards to. And yet they know our family better than some of our actual family members, better than some of our friends. They've seen us in our most vulnerable moments. They've supported us through some of the scariest times that we've ever experienced. And they've also celebrated with us so many, I would say, unusual and atypical wins, like, coming off of BiPAP or coming off of high flow, and just these small steps forward that mean eventually that we're leaving them, which is an interesting thing to celebrate. The fact that we are working as a team to say goodbye, not necessarily goodbye meaning end of life, but goodbye to the hospital, to discharge day, right?
Yeah, I relate to so much of this. And I'm even just thinking about, yes, the relationships that you form and the experience. It's almost like, I think part of the survival is finding these pockets of light. And I think this, the nurses that you connect with, kind of, it's funny to say this, but it's like recognizing, I know their schedules. And so I know that Reed's going to come back on Sunday and he's going to come booming in and he's going to check on Levi, and then being excited because, the nurse that you had yesterday is going to be back on shift today, and all this kind of stuff that really are it's like these islands of stability within this kind of hurricane setting, if you will, that they just offer us. I mean, essentially, it's like they become our partners. Like, these are the people that we are not just reliant on, but actually, I think similar to you is I am at the top of my game when I'm at the hospital. It's like I go into it's just like you dig into a deeper level than you think you have to dig in most areas of life. And yes, to the point of basically like you, because we've done this for so many years, we have become a consulting member of the team. So it's amazing because I love it, because honestly, it builds my ego a little bit to be like, oh, like they're asking me, like it makes me feel like like, again, it's my ego. It makes me feel important to be like, oh yeah, they need me. This is a funny thing to admit. But also it has so much pressure that goes along with it, because I realize, oh shit, nobody knows more about my son than me. And that means they don't know how to help him. Yeah. And that's scary. And so these relationships that you have that become familiar faces, it's this dual thing. Like you said, the goal is to leave them, and then you leave them. I'd mentioned this in an episode a couple back. It can be very confusing because you're elated to leave the hospital, yet it's also really sad.
Mm-hmm.
right? And you miss the people, not just the people. And then it's like in our cases, I don't think people talk enough about. So you leave the hospital and all of a sudden this whole support structure and access to doctors and food being brought to you is gone in an instant.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, you get to sleep in your own bed. And in my case, I don't have monitors beeping, but it's like still on high alert, right? And your system, to your point, is still very much going, the adrenaline is still pumping. I want to go back to something you said. You said something about kind of when you go into this activation mode, you said it might be unhealthy. And I'm just wondering if you think it's a more appropriate word to say it's unsustainable rather than unhealthy.
I'm going to be vulnerable with you and say both. I think it can be unhealthy. I think some of the choices that I make during those moments are unhealthy because I am putting myself last. I'm eating the chicken nuggets. I'm not resting well. I'm going most of the day not even really looking in a mirror. Not that looking in a mirror is important to my well-being, but like that just acknowledging that you exist outside of this situation, that you are a person too that has needs, that is unhealthy, I think. And I've really struggled with that because I don't think there's many ways to avoid that. And I think that a lot of our hospital systems, they recognize that and they do a lot of great things to try to promote giving you the opportunities to make more healthy choices in those moments of pure adrenaline. But we all know that when I say that autonomic response, like things are happening in us that we can't control. And part of that leads to the poor food choice or the not brushing your teeth until 2:00 because so many things are happening. Like just some examples of self-care that tend to go out the window for me. And sleep is really one of the primary ones. They always say, your mom, you're here, we've got your kid, we're going to do everything we can. You try to rest. I just am never really able to rest in that situation. And I think I've loved how you have referred to it as being a planner. I often see myself as someone who functions best when I have more control over scenarios, like more of a structure. And maybe it is needing to have a plan or just knowing what to expect. But that loss of control over the situation, the environment, there's an emotional component that goes with that. And I think that's something that I related to when you mentioned the doctors including you, the doctors consulting you. For me, I don't really think it's ego. I think I really enjoy that moment because it gives me that small little teeny tiny portion of control in the situation, that ability to provide my input in a place where I feel really powerless, really helpless too. And then, again, I can relate because it immediately is followed by, I don't feel like the expert though. And I don't want to be the expert because then that means that nobody knows. And that only time will tell. And it's just not the funnest period to be in.
It's really not very fun.
Honestly.
Well, thank you for sharing the distinction. There's this line in which you abandon yourself in service of your children and just acknowledging that perhaps there's an opportunity for you. It also, and I will share just because I feel like part of my survival, I think, is having little structures in where I feel like I got to keep connected to giving myself what I need. And they were little. Like for me, what that looked like is I would change my clothes every morning and night. So like daytime clothes and nighttime clothes, even though like your nighttime clothes are like, proper to be worn out in public.
That's a huge step. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also with that, I would, in our hospital, there's no bathrooms for parents. So you have to go down the hall, get access. It's a whole thing. It's obviously awful. And so, I would bring my bag. And this required leaving my son unattended for like 15 minutes if there was no one in line for the bathroom. And so I really did have to make sure like it was a good, like, there was this window, which I'm like, okay, this is going to happen at some point before night. I want to make sure it's a time where we're good. Right. So he was obviously stable enough to leave. And so, but I also had a full like 5-point process of my skincare to do. And I actually always kind of laughed to myself when I was doing it. I was like, I think this is funny that I'm maintaining this like higher level of like facial care than I even do at home. But for me, it was just little thing, couple minutes, just this simple thing I could do to kind of have this control, this rhythm, this routine, this thing I knew I had that, I felt great after I brushed teeth and washed my face and kind of got ready for bed. And just ready for the next phase. And so I think for me, just having those like morning and night rituals of like doing these things to feel ready for the day. So for me, getting ready, brushing my hair and getting my makeup on made me feel ready for the next day, no matter how tired I was. So
do you find that you're able to do that pretty immediately, or is it something that you gradually move into your structure? Because I can relate to all of that. And looking back, I realized those are similar routines that I have while in the hospital. But it does take me a couple days, at least 24 hours from that. And maybe it is because, it's unplanned. It's an emergency.
Yeah.
They're typically life flighted. I'm driving at 3 a.m, 3 hours away from the hospital. Like there's a lot. So I think it takes a couple days to shift into that. And then that's when everything just seems to sail so much smoother because I found my footing, I found the ground. And even if we're still in the deep end, I at least know we're walking to the shallow end slowly. Like I'm waiting there and I'm occasionally my toes are touching the bottom at least. So
no, I think that's a really good distinction. Thanks for making that because if I look at the sudden hospitalizations or even when we're being admitted post-op, like that is an intense freaking day. Like, right? Yeah. Intense. So definitely my first thought is not the routine and keeping that at that point. Like that is just when it's like all hands on deck in terms of really just sole focus on caring for Levi and of course your children. So I think it takes a day or two. And I think also, even in terms of packing, right? Where it's like, well, I had time to pack all my junk.
Right.
Right. Versus when it's been sudden, it's like, no, you sleep in whatever you have to sleep in. So until you can perhaps get back home and get some of your belongings. So I do think that it very dependent on the circumstance and kind of where you're at in the care cycle.
That's another component to this too, is every family's proximity to the hospital, be it planned or unplanned. If I leave something behind, I'm 3 hours from home in a city that I don't really know that well. And leaving my child's bedside is not an option. I'm grateful that most of the rooms have bathrooms where we stay. If it wasn't for that, and believe me, it has been that in the past, that's when self-care definitely plummeted because I can't leave their bedside. They require constant monitoring. And unless honestly they're in ICU, which we don't want them to be in the ICU, that's the only time they really have another person besides myself at the bedside nearly at all times. Yeah. So it's everything, right? It's your proximity, it's your circumstances. It's how ill they are. It's at what level of care you're receiving, what floor you're on, planned, unplanned, which makes this very complicated to address, right? Because it's a lot of layers.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you're talking about this, I feel like it's like realizing that the layers do indeed go deeper and deeper. And also I think it's funny to look at, like we both have such distinctly different experiences, but recognizing that we each have employed these survival strategies and techniques that have been working for us. I mean, we're still here. And I think for each of us in our own unique ways, as well as any listener out there, is like there's some opportunities in terms of perhaps taking the next step, like for you in really looking at like what would it take actually to move 1% more into health in those intense times or in any of the hospitalization times. And same thing for me, right? Is in terms of what does it look like to actually move towards, for me, it's all about my nervous system, right? And just supporting myself during those times. Anything else that you have on your mind in terms of kind of looking at that hospitalization component of it? I'm curious, even in terms of just kind of your overall life, what I notice is there's a stepping away from life, from like things moving on, from, you know, taking my other kids to sports events and to having picnics on the weekends. And, you know, it's when you're in the hospital, you're in the hospital. And sometimes it feels like life just keeps going. And sometimes I definitely have felt like weekends were hard for me. Because during the week, it felt like, you know, the doctors are there, it's all busy, we're like moving things forward. But then on the weekends, there wasn't as much going on. And
the weekends are the worst.
The weekends are the worst. And so I think it's like, that's just when it's glaring in your face that you are, feels like sitting on the sidelines while others are not. And I'm not saying that's true or not. That's just the, you know, that's the story we have in our minds. What's your experience? Or like, how do you cope with that? Like, what do you do to address that for yourself?
Well, I do think it is true. I think that became, I want to say painfully clear, but not that anyone had any intention of making it painful. But it did become painfully clear when we first began this journey with our daughter in the NICU. And the world just kept revolving while ours was stopped and stalled and occasionally puttering down an unknown highway of people just talking at you, and you're learning new terms and everything, all the scenery is unfamiliar and just terrifying. That highway has become more familiar. So there's a comfort there. But that doesn't mean that like the fact that we are no longer able to adequately nurture other relationships while in the hospital as we would outside of the hospital, that can be hard. There's a little bit of guilt there too. So it's definitely a lifestyle change that impacts all areas of your life, your identity, your relationships. I talked earlier about how it's nice to go in there and you see these familiar faces. But what I didn't mention is that I'm also getting messages from people we love, wanting details, wanting an update. And there is an emotional and mental exhaustion to that, despite the intent behind it being so thoughtful, supportive, caring, and good. And some days, man, I'm ready to send that message and it's a good message. And I copy and paste it and I send it to everyone and I'm ready for it. But not all days are like that. Some days I just can't even have that conversation.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is because I'm in the hospital. I'm hospital Erica in that moment. I'm nurturing the relationships that are immediately around me. And those are relationships I haven't had the chance to really catch up on in a while. So when things settle down with my child, I do that. And it's very therapeutic and cathartic. And it's something I take a lot of joy in. But there's a little bit of sacrificing the kind of real life relationships that I have back at home too. So it's a very interesting thing to balance. And I think I'm constantly trying to figure out how to balance that. And that balance shifts once again when you're facing discharge date, right? Because then you need to rally the troops at home and you need to start updating people and the communication shifts. My husband laughs at me because I'm pretty sure, maybe he's not said it in these exact words, but Hospital Erica is definitely a different Erica than like home real life.
That's hilarious. Hospital Erica. We should think of a alter ego name for you. Like,
oh gosh,
I don't know.
I'm Gossip Gal. I am totally Gossip Gal.
Gossip Gal. Oh, that's hilarious.
I want to know what's up, what's the dish, tell me all about it, who's doing what.
That is so funny.
And it's just like, I don't know, my own version of Grey's Anatomy, I guess. It's just me trying to really feel alive in a situation where like I don't have, I guess, a lot of other outlets in that moment. The one outlet you're facing is actually a pretty scary one. So yeah. How about you? Like, you know, when you talk about the weekends, you have, I have 2 kids with disabilities. So I know for the most part what's happening back at home in our immediate life. But you have kids whose lives are, you know, they keep moving. Things are happening. They've probably got sports and other kind of recreational activities. What's happening to you and your family during that time? And on those weekends where you're in the hospital, you and Levi are in the hospital, and maybe they're not visiting. Maybe they have other things to do. What is that like?
Well, it's interesting. I've looked back 11 years ago when he was first hospitalized for the long duration. I only had one other child, and I also was pregnant. That was a real treat to be pregnant while trying to support him through that. And having a 4-year-old, thankfully at that time, my parents were able to be very helpful in terms of just actually managing the life. But I feel like during the week, I could be like my version of the hospital Kara, where you're busy, you know, like certain portions, you're actually just very hands-on and actually keeping your child alive. And then we transitioned to having OT, PT, and speech every day. So it was almost like I went into like, I'm going to do this job and I'm going to do it well. So I was busy and had purpose and all that. And so then the weekends, we would actually get service on the weekends at that time on Saturday. But then Sunday was the day that was just really quiet. Like nobody was there unless they had to be. And those are the days where, you know, social media wasn't as big back then, but it just, I think, allowed me to create a narrative of I'm forgotten. And I'm not saying that that's true, because actually I look back and a lot of my friends did show up, but they also were doing their regular life, and that's okay. Like I shouldn't expect them to be like, well, Kara, I'm just going to camp outside until you're out. Like that's also maybe a bit skewed. But I think it's just, I look back and I was doing the best that I could, but I think it was a lot of comparison going on back then. So a lot of comparison and a lot of feeling bad for myself. But I fast forward now to more recently, and weekends, I think it just brings up the sadness for me of missing parts of my children's life. Particularly, I look back at this time last year and Levi was hospitalized on Halloween. So I was dealing with the heartbreak of my child missing Halloween. Like he was so crushed. He was so sad. And Levi is one of those people where as long as he has what he wants, he's like always happy and like literally brightens people's day. Like it's pretty amazing to watch. But that day he was just sad, you know, bummed. And no amount of, you know, candy coming in his room or people trying to be like, let's do this with, you know, child life. It wasn't enough. And I was coming on shift that day because with my husband and I switching off and, you know, did things to try to make the most of it. I had a really good Halloween costume, by the way. Yeah, I dressed as a nurse. You'll like this. I dressed as a nurse. Do you remember seeing this on Instagram? I like full on got scrubs. I had a stethoscope. I had a little pulley thing with a name badge. I brought in a Starbucks half full. Like I nailed it. I don't like Halloween.
Well, when I saw it on Instagram, I thought clearly you were meant for this because it looked so natural, scary natural.
I have to admit I have to admit I had fun with the hospital Halloween in terms of dressing like a nurse because I thought it was hilarious. Also awkward because people like in the elevators were like, oh, have a good shift. I'm like, no, I'm not a real nurse. I'm like, this could go real bad if they like expect me to help on something that I'm not qualified for. Anyhow, no, but so that was my way of taking the sting out for me, honestly. And I thought Levi would think it was funny.
Did he?
Also remember he did, but I also remember he wanted a Halloween costume. And so I remember going to like 2 stores on the way to the hospital trying to find something. And of course, everything's sold out. It's like the day of, and just being sad that I couldn't give him something that he wanted. But I remember just being so sad to know that my kids were all having their experiences and I wasn't there, like, and even my daughter, so she was 4 at the time. She did, she did great. She went with the neighbors and had a good time, but multiple times this year already. And even like over the last year, multiple times, Mom, you're going to be with me on Halloween, right? And just her very aware that I wasn't there. And it's hard to be with, right? Like, it's just sad. It's hard. And I think that's one of the impacts of when and even for you, like having your husband and another child back at home, like you're not there. And in your case, you're much farther from home. I'm only about 45 minutes away. For me, what's helped is just actually to learn how to process my feelings and acknowledge, oh, this is what sad feels like. And that's okay. Like, I don't have to make it go away. I don't have to talk myself up and like tell myself why I shouldn't feel sad or justify any of it. So yeah. So, and I think also then there's that manager part of like, in my former career, I was actually a project manager. And so I'm actually very good at coordinating and planning and looking ahead and kind of making things work. And so I think it just takes a lot of coordination to try to have my children maintain some semblance of normal, even though I also acknowledge like this isn't normal. So like kids, this is the whole family's in this, and I'm sorry, you're going to have to miss out on some things. And that's hard too, right? There's just a lot of hard. Yeah. Anything else on kind of the hospitalization part? And maybe we could start looking at the aftermath.
We've covered a lot of ground with the hospitalization part. There is still so much more that you could cover. It would be an episode of its own.
Yeah, so totally. I think for anyone interested, I do have an episode on surviving the hospital or surviving crisis. So I actually went into like much more detail of like different things that I found helpful and other people as well to kind of stabilize yourself so that you can actually be available for your child. Anyhow, I'll put the episode number in the show notes so you easily can find it.
I do want to say in a very strange way, it was nice to talk to you a year ago and know maybe in the back of my mind that this was going to be a conversation we would have, because perhaps we toyed with it in a joking manner as we were both sitting in the hospital, kind of just surviving, not really processing yet, but knowing that when we did process, we'd maybe want to do that together. And I appreciate that we've been able to do that, specifically about being in the hospital. It's a lot to unpack, but it's so unique and rare to have a friend to be able to do that with. So
I was just going to say, actually, when you say that, I'm like, yeah, that's, I think why, because, we're not the kind of friends that talk all the time, right? Like we talk 2 or 3 times a year, maybe. Right. And, or, at that point in time, we talked throughout the week. And I think there is something that was especially, I think, great for me. And it sounds like maybe for you too, of like, oh, I'm not alone here. Like she's doing this too. I don't even remember the content of our conversation, but I feel like it was just having somebody that really felt like they were there with me. Obviously, clearly not in the same room, but that you're experiencing the same hard that I was. And there's a lot of power in that,
Some people might call it trauma bonding, but I really do not like that connotation. It takes a lot of strength to do this.
Yeah.
Strength that like we really muster from nowhere, right? So I really feel like it's strength training bonding, if I'm gonna put a positive spin on this.
I do like that much better. Well, actually, that's a good bonding. Survival. I like that. That survival bonding is much better. What did you say that actually made me think about the next step here? Oh, it's like, so what you said was like, we put out so much. And it's like, you really do leave everything on the dance floor on this one, right?
Mhm.
And so then we go home, right?
Yeah.
We go home and we have perhaps new medications. In my case, I actually had, when he was 2, I had a child that didn't walk anymore, right? So I went from having a very typical toddler to a very non-typical toddler. And that was the hardest. And we won't go back there too much, but it's like a whole new life again and adjusting, and a tank that is tapped.
Mhm.
So it's just, I'm like, now I'm thinking about that. Like, this is just not kind to people. This is just not kind. So what's your experience like? What do you do to support yourself? Like, what helps you kind of fill those tanks the most in this transition time?
Well, in our world, being discharged does not equal being healed. It's not the same as being fully recovered. Being discharged for us is that our children have reached that point of stability where we can go back to our field hospital at home level of care. And you're right. Like, we just spent a long time talking about the details of a hospitalization. And I hope we have conveyed that we have not even touched on the depths of that. So depleted is a very accurate description of our energy level when we are returning home. There are things that fill that tank that I've had to learn in this 6 years that maybe didn't necessarily fill my tank 4 years ago, but they do now. And it is simple things like stopping at my favorite coffee place on the way home, or really just the excitement of being home and seeing my husband and my other child, getting to shower and sleep in our own bed. And while the care continues and the high support needs still exist, it suddenly feels so much easier than it ever did before, because we're all together and we're all home. And I can do it in my grossest pair of pajamas, or I can do it in my business casual outfit before I hop on Zoom for work. And at the end of the day, my kids start returning. And this might sound odd to people, but when you have kids who have like neurotypical developmental delays, the way in which they communicate their emotions is not what you typically see in our society with other people. It also takes a lot for them to communicate their emotions in whatever form of communication that they use. So when they're acutely ill, that goes away. And that's how you know they really don't feel good, because you're just not getting a lot of reciprocation. So definitely over the years, those small moments of communication, when I see that light return to them, when I see small smirks, when they sass me a little, which is honestly one of my favorites, when they're grunting at me and snorting at me to tell me that I'm not moving fast enough for them. And or just, they see me walk by and I see their eyes follow me across the room, and then they see the dog fly across the room after me and they follow the dog with their eyes. And those are the things that they're used to. And seeing them be aware of that and enjoy that is really what fills my tank. And again, all these things that are hard, that Erica prior to having kids could never have imagined, that Erica at the beginning of this journey was completely and utterly exhausted by, they are so much easier to manage because I've learned to appreciate all the small pieces in between that add up to really our atypical life,
Yes, that's a great podcast plug for you there.
Yes, we have a podcast. I have a podcast, Atypical Truth, where I explored, I spent a season exploring the journey from the beginning to the present and all the key players that were involved in that. And then I take consecutive seasons to explore other people's journeys with disabilities or complex medical conditions. And that was, another way of processing this and finding joy in it and finding my own identity in this as a mom.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It's interesting how, so essentially kind of getting back to your routine and obviously seeing your children become well. For you, it sounds like it really is the thing that fuels you back up. And I can see it probably doesn't happen overnight, right? It's almost like if we kind of charted this on a graph, we would kind of see this like big dip and then it kind of slowly going back up, which I'm sure is why we both laughed when you had the back-to-back hospitalizations with your son and daughter. So,
yeah. And, I think that's actually what sparked the idea of this conversation is because a month ago, you and I met and we both shared that we're still trying to put some pieces together of our life that really fell apart, or the things on the peripheral that tend to get pushed further into the peripheral when you do have to spend so much of your time, energy, and your focus on your child's well-being. For me, so my kids became ill and required repeated consecutive hospitalizations from December to about the end of April this past year. It was a really rough 5 months. And when we met in July, that was when I told you I finally felt like I was catching up. Mm-hmm. Like I finally feel ready to respond to people, to start initiating nurturing of outside relationships again. When I'm able to really kind of have a schedule, a structure and routine that looks closer to the norm that we're used to rather than the kind of chaotic version of life when you've come home from the hospital and you're returning to, I want to call them messes, but really it's the piles of to-do lists that haven't been addressed. You may not even have the energy to address those for weeks.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Following your discharge from the hospital. It goes back to that idea that for some families, for some people, being discharged does not mean you're well. It just means you're well enough to continue the care at home or continue the treatments at home. And that is another level of work and energy that we don't really talk about very often.
Do you ever get triggered when people that care about you and are meaning well say comments that indicate that because you're leaving the hospital, like everything's A-okay again? I find myself getting very like defensive or even just very triggered when people celebrate in a way of, oh, yay, they're home. Like everything's back to normal. I don't know what it is. I just feel like I just feel missed. I feel unseen and I feel like you have no idea. And that's a hard place to be, right? Does that happen to you?
Yeah.
You're like, no, you're the only jerk.
No. I think that, well, this kind of goes in with our experience and how it's evolved. I used to let a lot of people know when we were in the hospital. Like I used to cast a wide net, letting people, everyone that was associated with like my personal Facebook page. So friends and family from across the country, really the world now. And I would detail it. And then, yeah, I'd feel like the added responsibility of updating. And I think there was a point in time when it really felt necessary to convey that, yes, we're out of the hospital, but that doesn't mean we're well. This is not a condition that is really going to get better. It's a progressive, degenerative disease. So these are the early chapters. We have a series of novels to follow. And they will all have different themes that we center around, because maybe one day we're looking at a higher level of care in our home, because maybe there's a more intense need for higher intervention equipment, So I did used to do that, but I think it's gotten better. And because I don't really let a lot of people know anymore. That's just kind of an evolution of my.
Yeah, I can see how I've also evolved. I think there's two faces to that. There's the one side of letting people know. There's a couple things. One, like for me, like something that's really important to me is prayer and support from my community. And so there's like, if you don't let people know, they probably won't be praying. And also just like having people know what's going on in your life. There's that part. And I will add this part. It's hard to admit it, but like, and then there's also this piece where it's like little hits of, I don't know what hormone it would be, but like when there's a lot of stuff going on communication wise, it almost feels like it's a great distraction. It's like, there's a tension, even though it's not for reasons I would want, but there's that piece where I think that that's attractive. And then there's
the dopamine of being like validated and people expressing support and love and prayers. Like that is so comforting. And I want to say it's deeply appreciated. It's one of those things that I don't know if I could ever repay the 100%. Number of prayers and support that we've received, which also makes it a huge responsibility, right?
Yes. So on the other, exactly. And so then there's this other side where having to recount it over and over again. And how do you share? And then people, we had a carrying bridge, and like people that don't read the carrying bridge, and then me being like, please just read the carrying bridge. Like, you don't know how much information, and you're asking questions that I do want you to know, but I don't want to have to retell it again. Right. So there's this whole like management piece where it feels heavy. And then sometimes it's like, we're firstly being with what's happening. And then it's hard to be in automatically communication. It's kind of like, it's hard to be like the PR person and like the person all at one time. So I've also kind of, I think, especially even this last year, like just pulled back and recognized like, I think I don't share as much as I once did. And also for me, there's also the piece of, Levi's 13 now, like, I'm like, how much of his health, we can talk about it, but and he's very open, but I check in with him just to kind of think like, I'm not sure if everybody needs to know this part for different aspects of it. So
that's a unique factor in my own life, and the fact that my children are nonverbal and I cannot receive their consent in any way that, at least in my opinion, in any clear way, nor do I know if they'd understand fully what I'm sharing and the impact of that. And even if it's a good impact, like even if our story changes someone's perspective and that helps another person down the road, they don't have any say in that, simply because at this point in their lives, the type of communication between us does not exist. And so I also have had to evaluate what is appropriate. What is appropriate about this that I share? And so I've leaned more into expressing maybe my feelings while being hospitalized rather than the details of my children's status. And sometimes those updates, if I do provide them, hint to their status without necessarily, in my opinion, exploiting it, And it's just such a fine line. And it's one that I've had to, again, learn and unlearn how to navigate. But I also feel so exhausted. And I realize that I did use that dopamine, that hit of a dopamine that you mentioned, as a form of fuel. As I've evolved, and maybe you as well, when you talk about just being aware of your nervous system and how to regulate that, I've recognized that I don't need that anymore. I love letting our close friends and family know if it's relevant. And the conversations I have with my husband and our immediate family are enough to sustain me because in my mind, we're going home and I'm going to go back to normal conversations and I will have to process this again. And I don't really want that added responsibility of having 50 to 300 extra people to report to, because some families come home and they have case coordinators to report to. They have DMEs to report to. They have necessary professionals in their life that they have to communicate all these details to as the charts and the reports are being sent to those people from the hospital. So, 4 or 5 of those hour-long phone calls about what happened in the hospital with an entity that but is not really intimately involved in your child's care, that's enough to deplete you from really wanting to do that on a grander scale,
Yeah.
I mean, it's all facts. It's all very sterile. And I guess I just don't have the energy after that to fluff it for other people, because at that point, the language, you get into medical talk. When you talk about sharing the caring bridge, you've spent this time to explain a situation in layman's terms, let's say, understanding that a lot of the people who are reading your caring bridge may not use the medical terms. So for me, there's also a lot of mental obstacles and adjustment when you go from the hospital to home, because I've just spent 2 weeks using all these medical terms that our medical professionals can relate to. And then I have to kind of change it up for our people back at home.
It's a lot of work. And what I notice if I look back at writing posts and sharing information is also a little bit of a controlling experience that I have, that I'm trying to make sure that other people still understand how hard or serious or whatever the thing is, that it hasn't gone away, that, we just went home from the hospital, but we're still not okay. Newsflash, even though I'm a coach, I don't have it all down, right? I'm still working on all the things.
Hey,
but
that's
I just
the kind of coach we need.
Yeah. Well, hopefully. Yeah. Yeah. And I just noticed there's this and I think that's when I talked about the trigger earlier, right? It's when I don't feel like someone has adequately expressed how hard it still is, then I notice the urge to emphasize we're not done and it's not easy. It almost feels like they're devalidating what I'm experiencing, which they're not. They're celebrating, I'm thinking of someone that celebrates often the wins and maybe there was a clean scan recently. She's like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. And in my mind, I'm like, well, it's good. But behind the scenes that she doesn't see is a million other things, right? And she's not involved in that conversation. So I feel like there's this controlling bit of I want people to understand. And so there's obviously some work to be done there in terms of actually not trying to control other people's experiences and just being able to validate my own. So anyhow, a lot more on that, maybe on a new
Well, that's
episode.
important, and I just want to say, maybe I do have a different perspective on that, because I'm 37 years old and I've had 32 surgeries in my life. I grew up looking different, having medical equipment in a wagon behind me, and I've had to face a lot of people asking those questions and developing my response and learning the difference between someone sincerely asking because they care and they want to know versus someone asking out of curiosity, and balancing how much time you devote to the different audience,
Yeah.
So I'm 37 years old. And when I had my children, even though I had that figured out for myself, I had to relearn it for them. So that process may have happened a little bit faster, where now I could be like, I don't owe anyone an explanation. But the truth is, it's taken me a long time to get there. Much longer, much harder of a road before even my children were in the picture. So I hope that helps, because in a weird way, it's my entire life experience that has led to me being able to be where I am with so much of this,
Totally. Yeah. And I think it has so much to do with how we came in. And I think we all have our own histories and stories. And yours so happened to support you in this one area to be able to kind of navigate that part, which is amazing. And I'm sure parts of mine supported me in my own. But I think also this experience shows the gap of how much we needed to, like, how much we needed to grow in order to be the parents we are today. Anything else? I want to kind of bring us to a close. Anything else that's on your mind in terms of wrapping up this part of the conversation? And I mean, you guys can tell, like, we could talk for hours and hours because I think all of this could go so much deeper, and we happen to be people that kind of like going deep like that. So anything else that's just on your heart or mind?
I don't. I think that just having someone to talk about this with has been a really great experience. And I hope that someone listening, it helps them to initiate this conversation with others. Part of our journey is to be self-aware. And for us, that self-awareness was being vulnerable and saying, yeah, we're still putting some pieces together. And it's been a long time since we've been in the hospital, but maybe things aren't totally there yet. And that was vulnerable for me. And honestly, looking at someone like Kara and going, oh, she's still recovering from a hospitalization months ago, and I am too. It made me feel seen, validated, understood, and normal, which is kind of what we're craving in the end, right?
Totally. 100%. Well, yes. And I think it was obviously a gift for you and I to have this conversation. And I hope, and I trust actually that the listener will have had the experience of being the trio, imagining that we were at a coffee shop being like, oh my gosh, me too. And my guess is for those that have had experience with hospitalization, there was parts where they were nodding their head or thinking, oh my gosh, it's so different for me. Like, kind of how you and I had same and different experiences. So yeah. And I just am so glad that in this funky way called podcast that we can actually have this way of connecting with each other and with people that, aren't talking back, but we know are there. So I'll bring us into a close and just say to the listener, if episode has brought up any curiosities or questions or things that you're just like, wow, I really want to know more about that. Like, hey, reach out, like either to Erica or myself. Erica is an open book and has her own amazing projects and resources and missions that she's a part of. And I do encourage you to bring her into part of your circle because you're working on such distinctly different things than I would ever, just given your giftings and mine differently than yours. And so I think it's fun to be part of your circle and cheer you on and support you in ways I can, but also know that, okay, you're doing that. So thank God I don't have to.
It's same to you, sister. Same to you. We need coaches in life, I swear.
Well, we need people that are like changing the world and the law. So like there's
Thank
that.
You.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see you all in the next episode. One more thing before we officially wrap up this show. Sometimes when I'm listening to podcasts, I have the experience of wanting more. I'm listening at the very end thinking, I sure wish that episode didn't end. I invite you, if you feel in any way the same way, I invite you to the Special Needs Mom podcast community, which is a free group that I host on Facebook, where we as a community of fellow moms who listen to this podcast and are experiencing life in similar shoes, get to talk to one another, get to share stories, get to actually interact. I hope you'll consider joining. See you over there.